Okay, good evening. Well, welcome to the second part of the Global Humanities seminar series. We had a very interesting first part of the series in the fall, and we are continuing with the second part in the spring. And the person inaugurating the series in the spring is Susan McHugh. It's fair to say that I've known Susan since she came to UNE. And since she came to UNE, she's been doing tremendous work in the area, in the intersection of cultural studies, animal studies, and literature and film. And so I'll give you a small bio, and then Susan will give her presentation, to be followed by a question and answer session. Susan McHugh is, for those who don't know her yet, she's Associate Professor of English at the University of New England. All of her research and some of her teaching focuses on literary, visual, and scientific stories of animals. She is the author of Animal Narratives, Forms of Species and Social Agency, forthcoming from the University of Minnesota Press, the same press that publishes Donna Haraway's book that some of you may have read for tonight's event. And it's also part of the Post-Humanities series. And she's also the author of Dog, which was published in 2004, a volume in the Reaction Books groundbreaking animal series. You'll probably get to know more about this book probably in a presentation. Her essays on animals and literary theory have appeared in such journals as PMLA. For those of you who do not know what the PMLA is the standard is a journal of the Modern Language Association, which is one of the major journals in the field of literary studies. Critical Inquiry, probably the foremost journal in the study of culture, and Literature and Medicine. That is the range of Susan's publications and intellectual interests. Susan also serves on the advisory board of the H Animal Discussion Network, as a member of the editorial collective for the journal Humanimalia. That's as an international associate of the New Zealand Center for Human Animal Studies, and as a host faculty member of the Animals and Society Human Animal Studies Summer Institute. It's fair to say that Susan is on the vanguard in the study of this field. So I'm really honored to have her give a seminar tonight. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Anouar. I'm going to switch over to a wireless here, so if you'll bear with me for a second. Yes, it's working. Yes, okay. So thanks to you all for coming out on this dark and stormy night, and to Anouar also for putting together this fabulous and I think very forward-reaching seminar series. I'm going to be doing something very unusual for me. I'm going to be attempting a bit of autobiographical criticism. It's a new genre to me, and I'm hoping that you'll bear with me on it. I'll be talking about it and also trying to do a bit of it by the time we get to the end of this. And I'm doing this in order to give you a sense of my work, where it's come from, where it's going, to give you a sense of this field of interdisciplinary animal studies that my work is emerging within, and also to fill in for you a little bit more about why Donna Haraway has become such a leading figure in this field of interdisciplinary animal studies, which really is the crossroads between animal science, which is fairly established. I don't think people have puzzled looks on their faces when they hear someone say, well, I study animal science. But animal humanities, as some folks are beginning to call them, yeah, that raises a few more eyebrows. And the interfaces of these very productive interfaces, are what I'm going to be trying to fill in a little bit more about for you, especially through Haraway's most recent book, When Species Meet. As Anouar mentioned, it's one of the first volumes out in the Post-Humanities series by University of Minnesota Press, which my book will be appearing in later this year. Yes, that was a shameless plug. Yes, well, I'll return to elaborate later this strange new field of interdisciplinary animal studies and how it fits into this other strange term, post-humanities. But first I want to say a little bit more about my reading assignment, my choice of reading assignment for this seminar. At first blush, Donna Haraway and I couldn't be any more different. She's a trained scientist. She has a PhD in biology. I'm a trained literary and cultural theorist. I have a PhD in literature. Why am I talking about her? Why would I be interested, someone like me, be interested in the work of someone like her? So I'm going to have to do a little Julie and Julia thing, if you'll bear with me here for a minute. She's, as this book points out, as her book points out, there's a lot of details about her life that have helped me to say more about why, what the overlaps are in our work, not the least of which is that her dissertation was on, again, in biology, was on how metaphor works centrally in biology. My dissertation started from the breakdown of metaphor in literary studies in the 20th century. So we're both interested in figures of speech, and it's not by accident that we are. As she explains at length in her most recent book, she's the daughter of a newspaperman, so am I. You could say perhaps then that our interests in figures of speech are an inherited characteristic, if you want to go that far. But I think that sort of begins in some ways to begin to lay some groundwork there for why we might be moving towards the same thing from different directions, and maybe too, most importantly, as I'll talk at length about tonight, that my work comes out of, my academic work comes out of my work in animal training, and her academic work has actually led her into work in animal training. Again, it's one characteristic of her writing, consistent characteristic of her writing, that draws me back to it, that makes me love it, is that she's very careful, thinking all the way down to the word level constantly. So it's very appealing to a literary professor to find any scholar who cares that much about language. And in her choice of the term, the phrase, companion species, I think that's an exemplary instance of her paying attention to this. She's careful, for those of you who've read this book, to know this, and maybe those of you who've read the little book that preceded it titled The Companion Species Manifesto. Companion species is a term that she's careful to distinguish from companion animal. That has a different history to it, comes out of veterinary science, and distinguishes the history of veterinary practice, which started as an arm of the livestock industry, the meat industry. Companion animals distinguish pets and pet-keeping practices that grow and grow and grow within that profession through the 20th century. That has a history that's kind of hierarchical. It's us and them, you know, division within the discipline, but also it speaks to division between humans and animals that she's exactly not talking about. So she crafts this term, kind of, you know, a new term, companion species, specifically to think about non-dualistic, non-hierarchic ways about talking about relationships between species. Both of these terms are kind of all little on their own. You put them together and a whole bunch of stuff starts happening. She points out that the derivation of, the Latin derivation of companion is cum panis, meaning with bread. So you could sort of say it's a kind of breaking bread together meaning built into that. But she wants to tease it out a little further and says it's just with bread. And so it's a sense of eating with bread, what or whom you're not too sure of, that's built into that term, of being, as she says, mutually domesticated messmates. She uses that military term, messmates, and with inevitable problems of indigestion, of course. Want to paraphrase it a little bit further. In this sense, companion concerns being parodies. Not, you know, two different places, but parodies, meeting in the everyday processes like eating, like consumption. And if you move into the sort of verb sense of companion, you've got consort, or to keep company. That includes kind of sexual and generative connotations too. So there's a lot going on in just the term companion that becomes even more volatilized when you pair it with species, which can mean, on the one hand, unique, discrete biological organism, as in the term an endangered species, or it can be a sort of lumping together category, as in the great ape species. It concerns then the sort of very evolutionarily significant interfaces. It's not just a taxonomic category, it's not just a descriptor of a unique or specific or isolated entity, but it always concerns these kind of messy interrelatings. So as a theoretical concept, companion species works to take up the challenge of figuring a huge range of relations that are at once central to life and significantly other to our sense of our lives as our own. Indeed, she talks about this whole work beginning, this whole line of thought for her beginning with a party invitation from her dean, I think, that invites her to bring her significant other along with her. And the first person she thinks of is not her husband, but her dog, Cayenne Pepper. And in thinking that way, and in starting to unpack these PC conveniences of language, she's starting to think about this whole range of significant otherness that's entered into our speech, into our ways of thinking, and could go a lot further in our ways of thinking. Again, she's a biologist, a trained biologist, but she's moving into a form of animal training here that I'll elaborate in a minute. But I think it's important to remember that ideas, along with the realities of companion species, are always in flux in ways that we're just beginning to fathom. So throughout what I talk about, this is kind of a new territory in thinking, in conceptual thought altogether. And for that reason, I think it really does need to be rooted, and she makes a great case for why it needs to be rooted in everyone's everyday practice as well. Biologists out there, you all know this, but for the benefit of others, I'll say a bit more about how ideas and concepts of life itself are beginning to change. Haraway elaborates towards the beginning of this book the importance of companion species relations to life itself by citing biologist Lynn Margulis's theory of symbiosis, which postulates that eukaryotic organisms survive only through cooperation at the cellular level. Symbiosis emphasizes that cells are constituted by partnerships of bacteria, and formerly independent bacteria, that is, decide to inhabit a cell, and that's what creates the cell from the beginning, and yeah, we know where it goes from there. So we think we do. We like to think, before this theory was posited, of humans as descended from bacteria, or we usually go the other way, not descended. We think of ourselves as growing up and better than. Again, hierarchic, dualistic ways of thinking. And this idea, this theory, begins to try to account for why the Human Genome Project, for instance, discovered bacterial insertions into human DNA. What's up with that? I thought we evolved away from that, or we're above that. Instead, this theory postulates that we still are bacteria, and some people find this a deeply humbling thought. I think in my next project I want to develop a bit more about how a more pressing implication of this theory, particularly in light of the commercialization of gene-modified organisms, is that genetic mutation does not occur randomly or blindly, but rather is negotiated purposefully and by many partners at the cellular level. In other words, genomes change across species lines, even within our own bodies sometimes, perhaps. This is the theory, anyhow, and with motives and purposes that are attributable to actors along with actions that we're in dire need of words and figures even to think about. Again, that's something that I'm going to do next, so I can't really talk about it tonight, alas. Maybe you can tease me out in the questions about that. So Haraway's notions of companion species provides a starting point, and an especially useful one in developing this notion of non-anthropocentric agency, because it suggests a way of celebrating rather than bemoaning the newfound human condition of interdependence with other organisms, and at all levels of life. So she embraces Margulis's theory of symbiogenesis, or the biological forces of cross-species genetic manipulation through which all life evolves with the help of others. And she embraces it because it validates the evolutionary and other significances of what happens when species meet, and is prompting investigators to widen the focus beyond the conventional terms of the self and self-same reproduction. From this perspective, Margulis's theories become problematic not for having been avoided by scientists, although that's a problem for another time. The theories become problematic because of the ways in which they appear to have been retooled in order to affirm the status quo in science thought. As Margulis's work continues on through collaborations with her son, Dorian Sagan, begins to capitulate to the dictates of an older biological paradigm in which cells, selfish genes, and all other significant actions are read exclusively in terms of little individual actors. who are always microcosmic metaphors for the human subject. Margulis's more recent work reframes cellular partnerships in terms of autopoiesis, a holistic systems theory that is more friendly to the terms of human subjectivity, and this is precisely what Haraway objects to. She explains that such moves are theoretically incompatible with symbiogenesis because even this self-making process, autopoiesis, is premised on partnerships of significant others. Taking this biological theory at its word means that recursivity and relentless differentiation prove the far more important characteristics of companionable transactions across organisms. Casting this admittedly abstruse biological theory in more concrete terms, When Species Meet takes this point again and again through a startling range of examples. And these examples are all stories of humans and animals living together, working and playing every day in homes and laboratories, in schools and fieldwork, and most obviously perhaps in Haraway's stories of her own life and how that's led to the cross-species sporting fields of canine agility, where she competes together with her dog Cayenne. And this is just an absolutely beautiful image. So that's Haraway's hand, and she's giving the right signal, and the dog's doing what it's supposed to be doing. Those of you who maybe have seen this online before or on the web, it's the fastest growing sport in the world right now, and it pretty much looks like dogs running through like little horse show type obstacles, and it's timed, it's fast. So it's a sport that requires the handler to run alongside the dog. It's a very physical sport, and one that Haraway, who's, she says this is a book about being in her 60s, is finding challenging for a lot of reasons to be getting into. Yeah, so I'll say a little bit more about that too, but just in case you're wondering what this is all about, yeah, that's what I'm talking about here, canine agility. There's a lot to think about just at the level of experimental biological theory with this idea of companion species, especially regarding the independent individual self as a flawed and deceptive, perhaps, foundational unit of thought. But the wide range of Haraway's examples here suggests that it's not just a problem plaguing science. Thinking about companion species relations leads to direct confrontations with the problems of representing animals, that is, the challenges to scientific, aesthetic, and even political representation of those who remain significantly other to us, even and perhaps most obviously when we elect to do things together. They present a formal challenge in the broadest sense. I'm a literary scholar, so mostly what I'm focusing on is attending to representational forms and narrative form in particular. That's my job. And in my work, it becomes even more clear, the more I get into it, that scientific and political representation are never easily separable from aesthetic representation. In a recent interview, Haraway chafed, however, at the implication that the form of this book is problematic. The idea that the largely autobiographical and epistolary or letter-writing passages that flesh out the bulk of When Species Meet is merely self-indulgent. In her interviewer's terms, it's indulgent, I quote, along the lines of a lot of other academic criticism, especially feminist criticism, which in recent decades turned to metaphor and to memoir and autobiography. She counters that this approach is actually doing theory more in the vernacular, a method that has always, to her, included several voices and idioms that are brought together not by antagonism, but rather by attachment sites. What does she mean by attachment sites? And her personal tales, I think, about getting involved in canine agility are really important in this way because they illustrate how she works through models of kinship to something more complicated. For instance, there are these conversations and discussions that she shows, that she brings us into between her dog's breeders, and geneticists looking at this particular breed of dog. And the more the breeders are getting involved in talking with the geneticists, the more they realize they have a lot to learn from each other, and the more they realize they have a lot to share, and it's their common interests, the site of attachment, their attachment to this kind of dog that brings them together, all of them. Perhaps these attachment sites, these ideas of finding and negotiating attachment sites, become most poignant when she gets to the most personal parts of this book, which is towards the middle, where she's trying to figure out a way of connecting with her dying elderly father. He was a sports writer all his life. He has a passion for baseball, which is all the more amazing. There's this wonderful, that it's all the more amazing because he's a childhood survivor of polio. It's this wonderful image in the middle of the book that shows him up on crutches with the baseball bat. He actually played, believe it or not, back in the days before helicopter parents, when kids figured out ways of doing things for themselves. He played and ended up following his passion, not into a career in Major League Baseball. We're not there yet as a society, I guess, but into a career as a sports writer. He wasn't a sports columnist. He reported on games. He was a sports writer in the traditional sense. So he had a passion for the sport, a passion for team sports, that she is trying to find some common ground. She says, she's very blunt about this, referring to herself as a postmenopausal woman who hasn't chosen to have children, as like her spayed dog, Cayenne, reproductively silenced. So the usual ways, this sort of family chit-chat about children and dogs that adult children find of connecting with their parents, aren't open to her with her father, and she's running out of time at this point in her life because he's dying. So they figure out a way of connecting to each other through finding their shared passions in sports. And his interests were only in human sports, and hers is strictly in this human-canine, human-animal sport. So they have to figure out a language. They don't really know what they're talking about, and they don't really know how to do this. And there's this wonderful letter. It's an exchange of letters between her and her father. This wonderful letter where her father describes watching the videos of them in a competition and finally getting it. So the penny drops at some point. And it's just really very beautiful, very poignant just at the human level, that through this attachment site, again to sport, that you move into a different place, that you move into a new way of thinking. This, for Haraway, also leads her to question the lives of dogs in human worlds. There's a passage which is fast becoming infamous in this book, titled Klingon Warrior Princess, I believe. You want to look for it later, that describes elaborately the rules of a game that her dog has come up with another dog, and it's a dry humping game. Yeah, I won't go into the details. You can look for them later. But what's so wonderful and special about it, I read a lot of dog narratives. I know a lot about how people generally approach what to dogs seems like a very ordinary gesture. At least it's something that is in their vernacular. Most dogs that I know seem to know that. But it's also an incredibly complex behavior. For them, it has all sorts of meanings that we can't even begin to fathom, this humping gesture. And it's hard to find a writer who actually writes with sympathy in an attempt to understand what's going on in this elaborately choreographed and often repeated game, that she's trying to approach it with sympathy. Usually what we fall back on in our culture, especially our puritanical culture, is to sort of disrupt or stop or, kill the dog's joy, in other words. Even people who love their dog write about being so frustrated with that behavior and stopping it. Instead, she's stepping back as a scientist, as an observer, and just recording what she sees going on. Yes, you're snickering. I see this out in the audience. Probably out there in TV land, you're snickering too. That's good. At least you're laughing. I mean, this is the problem, that people are silent about it. And again, finding ways to talk about it, negotiating these rules of play, and understanding, or trying to understand, the concept of play itself as more complicated than we usually give it credit for, particularly, as she says, when you're negotiating rules across bodies that barely understand each other but enjoy what they are doing enough to want to keep doing it. That's a pretty complex behavior. That's the sort of thing that, along with trying to relate these stories, along with trying to share them, is well worth doing, in part because it hasn't been done much before, but also because it opens up entirely different ways of thinking about their significances. Again, as I hinted a little bit earlier, what she's doing in working through these rules of play and these various different sites, or contact zones or attachment sites, is grounding what could otherwise quickly become a very abstruse concept of the post-humanities in everyday lives, in lives that are lived, shared, complicated, but nonetheless, for most folks, ordinary and out there. Perhaps the most challenging critique in this book is of the shared ethical failures of philosophy as well as science in guiding animal laboratory research. There's a little punchy chapter towards the beginning of this book that does this, that shows us how training out of the lab and in the playing fields of agility, Haraway begins to see how technique, method, calculation, these are all characteristics not simply of instrumentalists that instrumentalist scientists appeal to justify working on animals in laboratories, but these are all the same characteristics, again, technique, method, and calculation that utilitarianist philosophers have used to justify animal rights critiques of that work. There's a sort of dead end, sort of locking horns that Haraway is trying to get us to move out of. And she's trying to get us to move out of it by bringing us back to the very first thing that should come before considerations of technique, method, and calculation, and that is responsiveness to what's going on, and trying to figure out ways of being responsive, not always just to dogs dry humping, but being responsive in responsible ways to what we're doing when we sacrifice animals in laboratories. Again, there's not a good language for talking about this, and that makes it so that the debates, the ethics that could follow from them are automatically hampered from the start, get shut down before they really get to anywhere that matters in people's lives, especially the people who do this every day, for whom this is ordinary. Yeah. To pursue this responsive ethics, we don't just need other ways of doing things, she argues, but also other words, too. And I'd add we'd need to consider more carefully other forms beyond words that up to now have been commandeered by literary and other strictly disciplinary studies. My own approach has been to elaborate how thinking beyond the terms of human subjectivity shapes the development of literary theory and even forms of literature like fiction, more specifically to question why this happens largely in the past century. So now I'm going to shift here and talk a little bit more about my own work. As I hinted earlier, the academic discipline of literature is an inauspicious place to begin this kind of investigation. Literary animal studies are framed by a paradox. On the one hand, animals abound in literature in all ages and all cultures. You can't find, it's very difficult not to find the animals in the texts. But on the other hand, it's been very rare that literary studies takes up animals systematically in any way. When attended to at all, literary scholars look at animals largely in terms of metaphor. And it's really only in the last couple of decades that this has begun to change. So we have, for instance, paramount here, the poet and critic Percy Bysshe Shelley making the famous argument about romantic poets that a poet is a nightingale. And in this little fragment that I've given you, he's citing the most famous representation of the Romantic artist's transcendence of human society, namely John Keats's 1819 poem, Ode to a Nightingale. He's doing that. He's referencing this poem, this famous Romantic paramount poem, and he's also limiting the literary animal's value to a figure for expressing the artist's increasing sense of political alienation. He's only treating it as a metaphor. Skip ahead 100 years, the same sort of move is still going on here. This is a very different argument for formalist aesthetics made by the likewise poet and critic T.S. Eliot, who's offering a different justification for prizing the self-same poetic bird. The Ode of Keats, he says, contains a number of feelings which have nothing particular to do with the nightingale, but which the nightingale, partly because of its attractive name and partly because of its reputation, serve to bring together. Sounds scientific? It's supposed to. This is the science of literary formalism that T.S. Eliot and his cadre are pushing forward as a way of sort of bringing literary studies into line to compete with the sciences in the university. And ultimately, they argue to win. We are the center of all the work of the university, learning how to read and interpret things properly. Another of these formalist critics makes the case that what you're training students to do is to have a well-honed machine for a mind, And to be able to analyze poems makes you capable of analyzing everything in the world. So he's definitely adopting a different rhetoric here, and I don't want to de-emphasize the important differences in these schools of literary criticism that these fragments represent here. But I think, too, it's important to notice that across radically different schools of literary criticism, the same animal remains important as a reference point, primarily to the work of the poet-critic hybrid here, as a gatekeeper of truth. And what I want to elaborate further is how the aesthetic structures of metaphor, though precariously supporting different calculations of feelings and rationality that positions a particular kind of human subject as it evolves through Enlightenment traditions, that these structures of metaphor are clearly, in both of these cases, unable to respond to the nightingale as an animal, let alone to deal with animals as agents in these scenes. In the genre of fiction, this problem is compounded by theories of the novel form as giving rise to this Enlightenment subject. The idea being that you read novels in the 18th century and people start to think of themselves as political subjects for the first time. Novels work as kind of handbooks for learning how to be a discrete self and to assert yourself as a political subject. The aesthetic subject provides you with a model for reading yourself and your own lives and the lives of others in this way. But a gaping hole in this rise of the novel argument, at least in English anyhow, is that forms do not automatically follow the functions of literature. At around the same time as Eliot was writing, the Irish novelist and cultural critic George Moore observed that this rise of the novel in English aesthetically and popularly lagged centuries behind its counterpart in other languages, namely French and Russian, arguing that the so-called great English novels of the 18th century lack intimacy of thought and feeling. Moore tries to figure this out, and his explanation is that there's a profound absence characterizing them. No one sits by the fire, he says, and thinks what his or her past has been and welcomes the approach of a familiar bird or animal. I do not remember any dog or cat or parrot in Vanity Fair, and I'm almost certain that Tom Jones is without one. Those of you who've read these novels are laughing. You know, they are without these animal figures. Companion species as a measure of literary form, though? A novel idea. Yeah, bad joke. Okay. So it's a fabulous passage, this. I was just delighted when I stumbled upon it in my research because Moore is not only anticipating the structuralist rise of the novel theory that actually comes in the 1950s. So decades later, he's seeing where people could go with this line of thinking, but he's also anticipating its post-structuralist critique that's really only happened in the past few decades. So he locates Dickens's novels as where this starts in the British novel tradition, and scholars of Dickens have really only picked up on this in the last 10 years or so. And what's happening in these novels specifically? It's a sort of budding sense of humanity as deeply beholden to cross-species intimacies. But I can't stress enough that this is a fraught road to fruition in literary criticism and literature alike. My own theory is that the success of the novel form follows instead from its usefulness for experiments with multiple perspectives and processes that support a spectrum that includes models centered on agency, situating that human subjectivity that others have seen for so long as all important along a range of other potentials. That these options, these various options, are influencing as well as reflecting ongoing social changes. So I get there by looking just at animal stories, too, which is also a curious thing. In part, my approach follows from a triangulated theory of animals as not simply iconic figures or ego projections, but more portentously forms of irreducible multiplicity. I'm not really going to get into explaining this model too much right now, or Haraway's critique of it. I think just the important thing that I wanted to emphasize here is perhaps the most intriguing potential of this theory, that animals can have different potentials, and that is that any one animal can serve in any of these three capacities. Any one representation of animals, like the poetic nightingale, could be doing all three things, for instance. Okay, so you feeling exhausted yet? Yes? It's because I just galloped you through 200 years of literary theory. Our first-year students, at least I give them a semester to get this far. We just went buzzing along. Okay. Yeah, so we went from Romanticism to formalism to structuralism to post-structuralism. I'm out of breath. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about animal narratives here. My book, my method has been to track a set of stories, really, as they mutate across time. And I'm really only looking at the 20th century, in part because, as Moore suggests, this is something that isn't really thought about much, if at all, until the 20th century, but also because the 20th century is pretty significant for companion species relations stories. And it's significant in part because you don't expect it to be. The last century is the century of extinction, right? Famously, John Berger argues that the modern period itself is characterized by animals as disappearing, not animals becoming significant, but being erased or effaced. Nonetheless, what I'd like you to consider here is how certain relations between humans and animals persist. So half of my book, Animal Narratives, looks at traditional relationships and how they become conventional or stay current. They have to change to do that, and those traditional relationships that I look at are animal breeding and meat making in particular. But it's also the case that new relationships arise. There are companion species relationships that are specific to the 20th century and fairly obvious as you start to look for them. One is modern guide dog relationships with their users. Seeing eye dogs in particular have this very weird literary history in which always the user of the guide dog is a white guy who's blinded and becomes a detective, and so has to have a seeing eye dog to do that. I know, very weird, and I won't talk about that one tonight, but yeah, I can tell you a lot more about it than you probably want to know. Also in the 20th century, very specifically, again, very gendered, very racialized, and very much involving human identity in a different way, a different kind of human identity, are these relationships that arise between girls and horses. And that's what I'm going to talk about a lot more about tonight instead. Say more about that in a bit. But the 20th century is also interesting to look at for this because narrative itself is changing through media forms like film, TV, World Wide Web, Twitter, manga or graphic novels, you name it, all ways in which narrative becomes a deeply visual form as well. That's also true of the 20th century. So one category, that sort of second half that I was just mentioning of this book, one category of relationships, these new ones that I'm particularly zeroing in on. I had to borrow a term from anthropology to talk about. It's kind of a clunky term. It's called intersubjectivity. So it's what happens between two subjects or what happens between the two. Comes from work like Merdine Anderson's on the Sami people of Northern Europe and their relationships with reindeer herds that in their language, unlike our own, very fluidly expressible to describe an action that can't be the human did that to the animal or the human directed the animal, manipulated the animal as an object. There's some sort of shared agency that happens between them that's irreducible. That's the language, that's the concept that I'm trying to work with here. And that's a language that erupts over and over again in the literature of service animals, that this is such a high level of training that there's no way you can manipulate or dominate a dog into doing the sorts of things that they have to do as part of their everyday work. Similarly, with high levels of horseback riding, it's not an easy thing to describe because it doesn't involve the human decides the horse is going to do that. There has to be this kind of responsiveness, this kind of fluidity in desire between the two. So I think, to get to talking about girl-horse stories, why they matter, and why, for instance, this portion of this particular manuscript was the hardest for me to write. I'll talk later about how it sort of relates to Haraway's autobiographical narratives about canine agility, but it's worth talking a little bit more about girl-horse stories. Why do they matter? Well, for lots of reasons. Stories of equine competitions in the past 100 years or so come to focus on a singular heroic girl character. By now we're so used to these stories that we expect the girl as national velvet, not only to win the Grand National, but also to be gorgeous, young Elizabeth Taylor at the same time. Yeah, we dream high, I guess, through this particular narrative. And a few points to be made about this particular image, and it's a painting posthumously unearthed in Andy Warhol's studio, one that he never showed, that is. One point to be made here is that a lot of what makes narratives of human-animal intersubjectivity so difficult to study from a literary standpoint is that these cross-species relationships have become deeply embedded and attached to identity forms, and in tension with images and image-making processes. This image actually represents a fairly significant moment in the narrative process of Warhol's work, where he is moving from using several different images within the same rectangle to tell a story, sort of a comic approach or magazine format, and he's taken these a lot from magazines, in fact all of these from magazines at that phase of his work. But it's also a moment where he's slowing down the story, and he's just serializing the same frame over and over again. Some art historians describe this as sort of mimicking the flickering effect of the cells of film when you slow it down. It's also, therefore, I love this image because it's about image making and the technologies of image making. So the way he's used silkscreen and manipulated it in a very unclean kind of way here is important. It's important because the novel and film versions of National Velvet feature girls doing this. There are scenes that don't make sense in terms of winning the Grand National, just getting from point A to point B, but that they are repeated. They are scenes featuring girls making and playing with pictures of horses, and ultimately preserving and protecting the narrative integrity of these images. But you're already thinking, I know this, that this is making a kind of stretch here, aren't you? Those of you who spend a lot of time around children, tell me where to find the horse toys, on the pink side or the blue side of the toy store. Yeah, you're nodding. This is a stupid question, right? Everybody knows where to find them, right? No, actually, it's not a stupid question to those of us who've paid attention to and tracked representations of girls and horses across time, because historically, these kinds of representations are as rare as hen's teeth. They're the sort of thing that you cannot find until the 20th century. You can count on one hand the numbers of paintings of girls and ponies together in the 19th century. Very strange, I know, you don't believe me, but it's true. Go find them, surprise me. I think you're going to find that it's not there. Why then is this a historically recent phenomenon? How did these powerful associations rise? You all know what side of the toy store this should be on, right? Why do you know this already, and why is this so recent, this knowledge? Lots of reasons, don't want to go into all of them, but a few to mention are, of course, the displacement of horses as the sort of engines of transport, of industry and military. They're displaced, of course, by planes, trains, and automobiles in the 20th century. And so horses don't disappear from our culture, but they migrate to a certain segment. They remain economically important, but they are just pretty much restricted to the field of sports. So thinking about how horses now are associated with leisure, that's one of the forces here. Another, much more surprising, that I discovered in my research is that in a lovely article called History from Down Under, the case is made for clothing conventions, and particularly underwear, for getting women involved in sports in the beginning of the 20th century. So underwear, especially elastic-banded, elastic leg banding in underwear clothing technologies, makes it so that underwear, this kind of underwear, isn't just a foundation garment, but the foundation of women's sports in general. And riding, of course, benefits tremendously from this, because girls can suddenly ride astride, and they couldn't really, they couldn't continue to ride astride as they grew up. So these two sorts of different trajectories, these changes in potentials for women in sports and girls in sports, and for horses in our culture, sort of converge and create something, a condition that becomes patently obvious through the 20th century, and that is that as women and girls come to compete alongside their male counterparts in sports like dressage, show jumping, and cross-country riding, that 3-day event that in the Olympics is one of the few competitive fields where men and women are allowed to compete against each other. Usually Olympics are gender segregated, those sports. This is one where female riders and male riders are both competing against each other in the same events. What starts to happen is that women win, as likely as not. As often as the men are winning, women are winning. So it's an interesting moment because there's a profound hope for social equality in human terms that then gets built into these, again, unique 20th century stories of girls and horses from the start. And also, as I started to track them across time through the 20th century, I started to notice that a nasty backlash is being built into it too. So tell me what you find when you actually go into the toy store and you head over to that pink side. Would you really expect to find this? Yes, some of you have found it. I found it by Googling doing a Google image search for pink plastic pony doll, and honestly, I just didn't know what to do with it at first. I've shared it with one of Donna Haraway's students, Natalie Hansen, and she's written about My Little Pony dolls. You recognize what these are? She was blotzed. I mean, she just couldn't believe that such a thing existed. I'm not actually sure that such a thing does exist. It's a photo, an image taken from a toy prototype convention, so I'm not sure that this thing was ever marketed, and I will call it a thing, thank you. I don't really feel like justifying it, except to say that in finding it, I found it included a lot on feminist blogs who propose that term, horse doll with a W, to describe what's going on there. But I think it's with anger and with humor that they are calling attention to this. It's funny in some sense, but if you think about it, and you think about it in the context of what the potentials are and how it instead leads to that, forcing a sort of cheapened sense of sex into the girl-horse imaginary, it becomes very disturbing. But it also links up with a lot, I think, of what's happening in the sort of backlash vein. One evolutionary biologist rather nakedly owns the operative assumption built into this toy that horses are a kind of training ground for infantile female sexuality, positing them, and I'm reading his quote here, as consolation for the great injustice done to girls by nature, of awakening sexually years before the boys in their class who are still playing with their train sets when girls are already sighing, "Trigger," when they actually mean Simon or Jeremy. I can't hide how I feel about this. I can't hide how I answer this question either. You probably can hear the collective snigger of horsewomen everywhere. Oh, the presumptions of Professor Filthy here. How does he know what girls are actually thinking? That's the big question here, I think. Such accounts raise huge concerns about the abuses of evolutionary rhetorics. After all, the historic novelty of such associations leaves no evolutionary time for the compensation of frustrated reproductive mechanisms here. If he's making this case in the context of evolutionary biology, it's not even working for him at that level. But what it does explain, I think, this kind of quote, is a nasty twist in the story of girls and horses. That is, the increasingly virulent and sexualized violence now directed at their togetherness in girl-horse narratives. Has anyone seen the 1970s film International Velvet that was billed as the sequel to National Velvet? Be prepared to be disturbed, because young Tatum O'Neal is chased by a drunken car full of boys who are angry with her for snubbing their sexual advances, and she's riding a horse and they're chasing her in a car, and she falls from the horse, the car crashes, and the boys burn to death. It's just really amazingly not pretty, really disturbing portion of what in many ways is a very disturbing story. How about the 1990s film The Horse Whisperer? Some people have seen this, so you know what I'm talking about here, because the beginning of that The first 90 pages of the novel sold this. That became a bestseller. He got a huge advance for this novel. He hadn't even written it yet because of that beginning, and that beginning, to ruin it for everyone so you don't have to go see it, is this magical trail ride that these young girls go out on their horses in the snow, and they're having a wonderful time, and it's beautiful. It's cinematographically beautiful. And then they get flattened by a semi. The girls and the horses are mutilated and killed. It's just one of the most disturbing moments in cinema, and yet this is something that's increasingly happening and more graphically happening in girl horse narratives in the 20th century. The wonder is not that such associations arise, I guess, so much as that they can continue to loft utopian dreaming in girl horse stories, that they don't get in the way of this continuing ideal that happens. This is why I think these narrative developments might be understood best through the ways in which they do and don't relay the mechanisms of intersubjectivity through which these human-animal working units achieve ultimately such historic greatness in the arenas of sport. Again, the early stories, like Enid Bagnold's 1935 novel National Velvet, and the 1944 that was a bestseller. The blockbuster film comes out within a decade, starring Elizabeth Taylor, as you saw. And that novel is misshelved today with juvenile fiction. It's very disturbing. That all of these earlier texts are at pains to relate not just the daily grind of training, but also to clarify how, in this instance, it involves the much harder imaginative training that enables these girls and horses together to blast open what exclusively had been, up to that point, a man's world. That's why it's so important that these narratives, I think, include images of image play itself, sequences that concern conscious and deliberate negotiations of radically different relations with bodies and bodily relating that hones their competitive edge, making it so that they not only enter transformative spheres, but also do so in a way that enables them to triumph in these contact zones. These representational patterns, I think, echo Haraway's stories in insisting that some aesthetic developments in narrative form are matters of life and death. And if you'll indulge me a bit, likewise I want to venture into autobiography to flesh out such a very bold claim. Part of what makes this difficult and necessary for me to write about is that I used to inhabit this particular contact zone. Yes, that's me, and a very talented friend a long time ago, and he was just 6 years old. The ground line's kind of unfortunate because you can't really see that, maybe you can sort of fill it in, that it's at least a 3 or 4 foot fence, and he's jumping it as if it's an 8 or 12 foot fence. He has a lot of talent. He's doing it not with his knees tucked up, like he's barely doing it. He's just sort of flinging himself, and I'm going along for the ride there. This isn't an example of stellar riding. It's just a slice of my life. To substantiate what follows here. This is something that I draw from. This is an experience that I had that I draw from, but I don't write about ever, actually. So that's why I'm sort of doing something new and, for me, weird here. And I was lucky then and diligent enough to be open to some extraordinary moments, this one included, and a different one that I like to that I've tried to struggle to tell the story of concerns this horse when he was a bit younger, when he was just 4. This is a story that I've tried and failed to write about for years, so please bear with me here. I had turned him out into one riding ring, just an ordinary day, while I was riding another horse in another riding ring nearby. This one, Bally, was very young at the time, very mouthy, and he started quickly, immediately, to play with the lone bar that was resting across the gate to the ring. In retrospect, a single bar between a 4-year-old horse who doesn't have a lot together in his brains, yeah, it wasn't a good plan, I think. But nonetheless, yeah, so I put him out there and then took off with the other horse to ride in a ring where I could sort of see him now and then. He was sort of down here, and every time I came around this corner, I could check in to make sure he was okay and nothing was going on there. And I just sort of settled into an everyday training routine, and then set a sort of goal for myself, which was to practice something called flying changes. That's when, at a canter or a gallop, you get the horse to, in one stride, change the lead, as they call it. And to do it in a kind of way that's seamless, and it's done with split second, within one stride like that. It requires communication through the seat. Riding instructors will tell you that you have several contact points, your hands, your legs, and your seat, otherwise known as your crotch. It's a communicative tool in riding, believe it or not. I know we're a puritanical society. We're not supposed to talk about these things. We're not supposed to know about them, but you can't do high-level riding without using everything to your advantage. And the seat's a very subtle communicative tool, believe it or not. It's the one thing, it's the one way in which you can give the signal to do the flying change. So it's very hard to teach because you can't actually watch someone doing it, or you can watch them but you can't see what's going on. It involves a very subtle shift in balance of your weight, and if it's overdone, it just sort of, everything gets messed up. And yeah, I was just trying to get it, couldn't get it, fine, just quit for the day on that. Went back to cantering around the ring and noticed out of the corner of my eye the little horse pick up the bar and drop it at his feet. He's completely free. It could have been another beginning of the Horse Whisperer scene of him just taking off and me trying to flail after him out into the road. And yeah, that's not what happened, though. Instead, what happened was something that was incredibly magical and incredibly difficult for me to communicate. What happened from my perspective was that I saw him, that happened, the bar dropped, and within the stride, the horse I was on changed leads, and we cantered around the corner, cantered out the gate, which you're never supposed to do at a riding ring, and within not even 10 seconds, we were standing in front of the little horse as, his 4-year-old brain working. You can hear the gears grinding. The bar is down. I am free, stepping forward. His foot hadn't hit the ground yet when we were in his face. And if I tried to think about this, if I had tried to say, okay, he's going to get loose, we better go, it wouldn't have been fast enough. It wouldn't have happened that way. Something else was going on there. What did I experience? Did I experience training as the ultimate domination of the animal, and I'm using him as my instrument to do whatever powerful thing? Again, that's the language that we have to talk about this through utilitarianist philosophy, animal rights philosophy, and we have that perhaps through instrumentalist science. That would be the language that you could begin to talk about something that I don't think actually happened there. Instead, what I felt, I think, was a centaur-like suturing of the bodies, very different bodies, that was premised on a mutual responsiveness, that all that training that I thought was focused consciously on, I'm going to learn this today, or we're going to try that today, there was something else that we were training for, and it was that responsive moment where a mutual responsiveness could happen, an openness to communicating with each other in very subtle, instantaneous ways. Much later now, I know this phenomenon to be called isopraxis, and it refers to the unintentional movements that characterize high-level writing. This is ethologist Jean-Claude Barré describing it. Who influences and who is influenced in this story are questions that can no longer receive a clear answer. Both human and horse are cause and effect of each other's movements. Both induce and are induced, affect and are affected. Both embody each other's minds. This is a scientific ethologist trying to describe what he observes, not maybe as a practitioner so much as trying to describe what other people say is going on in moments like the one I just tried to describe to you. I'm struck by this passage for a lot of reasons, and not just because Haraway quotes it in When Species Meet. It also echoes, again, that working unit language of guide dogs, where people say things like, Winnie is my eyes. What is your relationship with your eyes? Just, whoa, I don't know how to do this, and this is a different world that I'm not used to thinking about. It also justifies the need for the kind of narrative image play that I've just been talking about, characterizes girl horse fictions throughout, whether they're, predominantly hopeful, as in the early National Velvets, or predominantly scary and frightening, like International Velvet and The Horse Whisperer. I think this passage also is important because it locates a kind of thinking, a concept, but also a way of thinking that's incredibly dangerous to the self-centered, self-indulgent model of subjectivity that I've been at pains to explain here limits thinking across the arts and the sciences. It's dangerous, indeed, to the pigeonholing of thinking in disciplines that are good at disciplining human bodies only at the expense of attending to their production through companion species relations. As I mentioned earlier, my work follows narratives as they mutate across verbal and visual forms, and one of the images that I write about in Animal Narratives is from this beautiful project by a very young and incredibly talented Australian artist named Kate James. Please don't try this at home. Please, no one, try this at home. I gasp, here, I'll do this every time I see this, because, yeah, I remember being trusting enough to try this sort of stunt with 1 or 2 or maybe 3 of all the horses I've ever known. So I knew before asking and finding out for sure that this is the artist herself and a horse she's known for years. She says her first love, who she grew up with, her Appaloosa mare, Succotash. So I knew this wasn't something that anyone in good conscience would do with a model and a horse they'd never met before, or at least not do it without expecting the likely possibility of mortal injuries, really. It's a very, very dangerous thing, but it looks so easy. It looks so beautiful. It looks so fragile, because it is. The title of this piece is genius, too. It's called "The World is a Dangerous Place." I love that because it reminds me of a time when I was talking with Marcus Friedrich, whom some of you know is our colleague here in biology at UNE. Actually, we were comparing scars of injuries sustained in the line of duty as absent-minded professors. We share this in common. We don't really pay attention to what's going on around us. And finally, he said, life is dangerous. That's what keeps it interesting. And I thought, you know, this really describes a lot more than just my habit of getting scars all the time by not paying attention to what's going on around me immediately, thinking way too up in my head. This is an observation that I want to conclude by asking you to apply to relations of companion species, to considering how the playing fields of canine agility and equestrian sports that I've sketched above here require a sense of curiosity that is dangerous and above all self-endangering. In Haraway's terms, it's a sense of curiosity as a precious and a fragile and a not very nice virtue. By engaging the sense in which curiosity holds transformative potentials for bodies, species, even disciplines, these kinds of animal stories, along with their telling, here come to matter as more than just illustrations of ideas or concepts. This approach to narrative practice has its own integrity, demands that narrative be taken as having its own integrity, which in turn demands being taken on its own terms. And to conclude, citing Haraway again, this approach grounds the most developed theory that I've ever done. Thank you. Just in case I bummed you all out with the girl horse story thing and making you think about the horse whisperers beginning again, I'll conclude with a happy ending for those of you who need it. That's Bally and me again, 20 years later on the beach in Cape Elizabeth with our kin and kind. So, questions? Should probably go back to the beginning here. Yes, Tim.
That was very powerful. Thank you. You know, you talk about horses and dogs. I mean, these are species that I sort of assume, or that you can assume have some kind of empathic relationship with humans. What about other species? I mean, can you make the same kind of statements about cats or other animals that you might have a close relationship with?
Yeah, the companion species portion of it, I think, is, again, really important because, again, it's about parity is meeting. I don't know about you, but every time I try to herd my cats, I get hurt.
I'm allergic to cats.
Oh, okay.
Good anti-cats.
I think it really, this line of thinking challenges a lot of the theories of domestication that have happened so far, of thinking of animals primarily in instrumentalist terms as subordinated or tamed by us. It forces you to start thinking of how dogs go a long way towards learning how to live with us. They have to do that in order to live with us successfully. I'm a survivor of childhood dog bite. This part of my face was hanging on by the skin when I was a 4-year-old. And a very talented, wonderful plastic surgeon makes it so that you brought that up very well, Jim. I didn't know your face. Very kind, thank you. But yeah, no, it's not as obvious as it could be, but I've thought a lot about that too, about how dogs do an awful lot of work. It's not just that we have to do a lot of work to help them be socialized. They actually are very generous creatures in making the efforts to try to understand when we don't necessarily share languages. Like you said, a lot of it we can think of in terms of empathy, we can think of it in terms of generosity, but again, Haraway's term is, I think, very apt. It's responsiveness and learning how to respond coherently to one another. That, I think, maybe works better as a model for all sorts of species that we've learned to live with and also to live around. Maybe our mice and our cockroaches in our lives are also very responsive to us. They have to do that, especially for when you're trying to kill them, yeah, to keep going on. Here? Yeah. There's a whole literature that's erupted, and I would direct you straight to the Animals and Society Institute webpage as a sort of hub for this kind of work. A lot of work has arisen in psychology and deliberately trying to create different models for working with animals in research that aren't the traditional, execute them all at the end of the test kind of model. And through that research, where people have been taking relationships between people and their animals seriously, starting to track their health and well-being, I think you see these studies come up now and then that you're much more less likely to have high blood pressure, for instance, if you own a dog. And these sorts of data that have come out of it really affirm companion species relationships by and large. That I think the prison rehab ones are relatively recent, so there's not a long-term study of that yet, but I think all of those studies, as far as I know, all of those projects, those experiments, have unprecedentedly wonderful results. So there's a way in which there's a lot of work that needs to be done there, but that work's not going to get done unless people are taking it seriously to begin with, are recognizing that animals are important parts of our lives and that they always have been and I think always will be. But yeah, it's a good question. Yes?
I have two questions, but I'm going to leave some space in between and let someone else.
Could you please speak in the microphone so that...
Oh, sorry, I forgot.
A couple of questions, and I'll leave some space in between. The second one's so unrelated to the first one that it's not fair to...
Excuse me, just do this for you. And then
thank you. The second one is so unrelated to the first that it's not fair to ask them together. It seems to me that throughout the history of our relationship with animals, most of our history, we've either been running away from them for our fear of our lives or eating them and making them do our work for us. So there was some sort of switch, and maybe, I don't know the history of this, but post-industrial, when we became an industrial society and we didn't need our animals to work for us so much, they became more our companions. So is there a real change in the representation of them in literature and the arts, visual arts, at that point?
Great question, Peter. I'll try to approach it really from the terms of representation itself, because what's fascinating, and there's this wonderful book by an anthropologist, Matt Cartmill, titled A View to a Death in the Morning, and it's an anthropology of hunting. And what's so fascinating about it is the beginning of the book, where he sets up this man the hunter idea, right, that this is our human evolutionary role. And he tracks how this is an invention of scientists in the early 20th century, that people didn't think about humans that way before. Anthropologists in the beginning of the 20th century became enamored of this idea and then tried to get all the data they could to retrofit this theory that they had. And it's amazing and fascinating to think of how much power representations have, because again, this is another one by the turn of the 21st century that's so ingrained in our ways of thinking, it's really hard to imagine that we aren't that this isn't true of us, that this isn't our story. That stories have this very fluid and very powerful influence on what we look at and how we look at what we look at. It's just endlessly fascinating to me. Now, thinking in terms of, these companion species relationships and how across art and culture it reflects certain changes and certain consistencies as well. One of the things that I found so fascinating in my research for the dog book, which is by the way, a cultural history of a species. So I got dog, which is probably one of the most difficult ones to do, because pretty much as soon as humans are defined as a settled species, dogs have always been hanging around with us. So every culture, every time, you have any human artifact, dog artifacts aren't that far, or representations of dogs aren't that hard to find around them. Bones of dogs are found around settlement sites, the earliest fire pits and that sort of thing, where we think people began to settle, or human civilization began, as the story goes. But as dogs are traveling around the world and displacing what used to be the widest ranging animal, wolves, dogs are traveling with us around the world. The stories of them mutate, migrate, and sometimes stay the same in fascinating ways. One of the most persistent prejudices in our culture is against postmenopausal women, and all gay people for that matter, with little dogs. We all sort of stare, oh, a little dog, right? Poor little dogs, it gets a bad rap. But this is a story, this is a sort of a pattern that, as I started to trace it, I found on every continent, and it goes back as far as records go, ancient Rome, beyond. This association of women with little dogs, and then this disparaging of it very quickly, too, particularly with capitalist societies. So it's very interesting. For instance, it's one of the Canterbury Tales, the Nun's Priest's Tale, features the nun who gives her love and her meats to little dogs that should better be spent on men, right? All kinds of associations here that just sort of stay the same, too. So I don't want to say that the 20th century sort of changes everything and it becomes this great place where the stories change, but they can and they do. And certainly the urbanization of the human as a species has to be looked at and in explaining this, that we like to think about Americans as becoming a urban society at the turn of the 20th century, right? More people are living in cities from 1900 onwards. But this is true now of humans globally. I think it's within this decade that we're predicted to worldwide become an urban species for the first time in all of history, perhaps. So our relationships with animals are necessarily changing in radical ways, sometimes too, because of that. Good question, Matt. Thank you. Other questions? David?
Hey, so have you seen the recent article about the stray dogs in Moscow taking the subway?
Yes, Anouar forwarded it to me.
That's fantastic, isn't it?
People have sent it to me since, but yes.
There was a lot in what you had to say that I simply didn't understand. And there were some things that I understood sufficiently to agree with, and some things I understood sufficiently to be perplexed about. So if I could ask you a couple questions about the latter. This fellow Deckers that you gave the quote for, I mean, that sounded Freudian to me. It didn't sound like anything that an evolutionary biologist in the right mind would say. And by which I mean, of course, that didn't come across in the right way. In other words, I didn't see any residue or any indication of Darwinian thinking in his claim. So, I mean, was he purporting to give an evolutionary account?
It's an odd moment in an otherwise very intriguing book. I think it's a one-off moment, you're right, that I've isolated it and somewhat unfairly painted him. But on the other hand, there's a way in which its dearest pet is a evolutionary theory of bestiality. as significant to human evolution, and he similarly, finds examples from all over the world in all different cultures. And he's Dutch. He's trying to rock our world a bit. He's being a little edgy, no question. It's a very challenging book, but it just struck me as a moment where he's getting kind of lazy in his thinking, and there's a way in which that approach, particularly the kinds of evolutionary narratives that we're used to thinking of, he's not challenging. He's falling back on some prejudices and some stereotypes that I think, are sort of validated in a way by an institution, Freudian psychoanalysis, and if you're not really tuned into the particular content that he's talking about, like I was at that moment, it could just slide right by you. So that's, I think, what I was trying to do there.
Okay, but I don't understand, again, if you could clarify, how is he, this is not rhetorical, it's a genuine question. How is he falling back on evolutionary stereotypes in doing that?
It's situated within an evolutionary
Yes.
argument. He's falling back on Freudian
Yes,
psychoanalytic
okay,
stereotypes.
yes,
Infantile
precisely,
female
yes.
sexuality.
But we would, I think, both agree this is very far from anything like a mainstream Darwinian account of anything at all.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. The other thing that puzzled me was you made a couple references to something in my area, utilitarian philosophers.
Yeah.
The first one had to do with Haraway's, if I understood correctly, Haraway was claiming that the utilitarian thinking about animal experimentation was insufficient or misguided or something.
Insufficient.
Insufficient. Okay, and she made some sort of recommendation that it be supplemented or replaced by responsiveness?
Well, recentered by this notion of responsiveness.
Could you explain that to me?
Well, I guess it sounds like there's a particular tradition of utilitarianist philosophy that you have in mind here, so maybe elaborate that first.
Well, when one says utilitarian philosophy, we're talking about a moral theory which states that the moral value of an act or a practice is based on the degree to which it promotes non-moral good as opposed to the alternative. Mm-hmm. So in other words, something's good if something is good, morally good, to the extent that it maximizes non-moral good. So something morally good if to the extent it maximizes non-moral good in relation to what else one might do, in relation to the alternatives. So a utilitarian justification of animal experimentation, I'm not a utilitarian, by the way, but the idea would be then that animal experimentation increases the sum of well-being or happiness or whatever, more than the alternative, refraining from that. And so that's what I read, that's what I understood when you were talking. But then I could not understand at all the notion of responsiveness and how this served as an alternative or a corrective or...
Yeah. The language is slippery here. What she's having trouble with, and I'd refer you directly to that chapter, that little chapter in the beginning of the book as really, I don't want to misrepresent what she's saying, but what I take away from it is that it's frustrating to use these same, not just moral in the general sense, but specifically Enlightenment, Christianity, language that leads us to, terms like sacrifice for what happens to the animal at the end of the experiment, loaded moral terms that just sort of get casually integrated and not really thought about much. It's time to sacrifice. It's not the same, that same phrase said in the church would have a very different meaning, we would think. Mm-hmm. Maybe not, though, too. Mm-hmm. Maybe we've grown lazy in our thinking that way, too. Mm-hmm. We've fallen back on this language that does something for us, but what's it doing for the animals is a whole other question. And what's it doing for us in our relationships and what we could be doing with animals instead, that's a huge question, too. And that, you would think people who make this their job to produce knowledge around these sites would be more aware of. And I think she's just trying to spark that awareness, trying to get people to be more interested in this. So that's probably not a very good answer, so a very good question.
But I could see, if I could just be permitted one more comment, and I don't want to dominate the microphone by me. Now, I could see an argument, certainly an argument could be made that traditional utilitarianism considers only human well-being.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so and we might want to take the line that we're concerned with well-being or flourishing generally, in which case it can't be prejudiced towards the human case.
Mm-hmm.
In any case, I'll thank you for the talk, and I'll sacrifice the mic.
Well, what I take away from that, too, and what I take away from her work here, is a way of thinking of what I do is not necessarily beholden to philosophy. And I'll give you just a little wee anecdote from an exchange that I had over the summer with the utilitarianist philosopher Peter Singer, famous author of Animal Liberation, who, after a panel that I was on teaching animal studies in tertiary environments, asked the question. I was on the panel with a philosopher and with a psychologist who actually does cultural studies work in an English department now, very interesting person. And I was just talking about my animals literature and culture course. And the question I got was, why don't you start the course? I'd just given the pitch that I start the course with, readings and writing assignment meant to get students to reflect on what they know, their experiences already with animals. This time around, I appreciate in a very different way the challenges that you're faced with as you try to write about animals, or as you try to, incorporate animals into your art somehow. And the question I got from Peter Singer was, well, I don't get this course at all. Why don't you just start with animal philosophy, tell students how to think, and then show them how to read these texts properly? From a moral standpoint, from a philosopher's viewpoint. David, you're nodding, you're a philosopher. Hallelujah, you say, right? To me it doesn't work because I'm a literature professor. To me,
I would take the first part of what he said. I wouldn't presume to have to read very
well, and also to...
But I would
But this was my case, this was my pitch here tonight, this was my story then, and I'm sticking to it, that engagement with literature, if you really take artists at their word, if you really take writers at their word, creative writers, you really have to engage in that creative thought practice as well. And you can't do that without these different sites or these different interfaces of disciplines, but you also can't do that without understanding that the ways things, the forms that people work with have an integrity and really need to be taken with on their own terms. And I'm borrowing the phrasing here of my friend, the art historian Steve Baker, who makes this case in the much more dangerous zone of contemporary animal art right now, too. Ooh, exciting. Do you want to read them?
Go ahead and read them, and read them aloud to the audience so I can read it.
Okay.
First one, no, the second one. First one will be this one.
Oh, from R. George Young, who is giving a lecture as part of the series later in the spring.
Yes.
Susan, fascinating lecture. Could you say whether much research is being done on animals' fields of awareness not necessarily shared by humans? I know Rupert Sheldrake has written about dogs who almost telepathically know when their people are coming home. Anything more like that going on? That's a whole, like the ethological work on animals that's being done through journals like Anthrozoos, Society and Animals, PICETA, I can't remember what the acronym is, what that stands for, Psychologists for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, I think it is. Their journal are definitely publishing studies like that. And there's a lot more work emerging as people start to, again, take very ordinary animals that can be found all over the place as research subjects and figure out methods of experimentation that are measurable, are controllable, but involve animals living in more ordinary environments like human homes. That kind of work is happening. It's been happening for a few decades now again, but I think it's flourishing as far as I can tell, those sorts of studies. So. Okay. From someone Marilyn Gugliucci, who gave a lecture, she was the last one who gave a lecture? Yes. In this series, yes. So this was fabulous. And as a Morgan horse owner, she says, your talk resonated with me on many levels. In the field of aging, her specialty, it is known that when communicating with other people, only 7% comes from words, 38% from voice tone, and 55% from body language. That's within our species. It appears an important point related to the companion species is the concept of mindfulness and how it serves to aid us in the awareness of movement and tone in communication. Would appreciate hearing your thoughts, feelings on this. Thank you. Yeah, okay, so that's just a different take, I think, perhaps on David's question in some ways about what the role of mindfulness is in these spheres that I'm talking about here and how that mindfulness migrates out into a bunch of different locations. But I like about this question especially that she's bringing us back to how it applies within the species. So why does this matter? Why should I care about people who play with their dogs or people who grew up with horses? It's not just about, individual experiences. It's about shared potentials and what we can learn from people and others who are radically different from us and continue to do so. And that can happen between people. Again, it's a sort of openness to recursivity and relentless differentiation that's at the root of this significant otherness, and what makes otherness, what makes some differences that matter. So, yeah. It's fabulous. Okay. Any questions here? Meanwhile?
Okay, so I wanted to come back to Tim Ford's first question about the emphasis on species that can experience empathy, or just an emphasis on a kind of anthropocentric, if that's the right word, animals, if we're in some sense creating a distinction between animals whom we can see some humanness in, or who have what we would call empathy or ability to sort of sense certain things, like these special dogs. If that's a problem, because then what happens to all those other species like sharks or cockroaches that don't have these kind of lovely human qualities that we can identify with and faces, and communicate with. And I'm also interested in what you might have to say about how the focus specifically on companionate species, or this anthropocentric view of animals, might romanticize our relation to nature in ways that could be dangerous, so like the Werner Herzog documentaries are the first thing that comes to mind about Grizzly Man, that we have these sort of like lovely idealized views about how we relate to animals and, sort of the potential. So I'm giving you a kind of skeptical, I guess, set of questions about what it means simply to focus primarily on, whether it's in your work or Haraway's work, on the species that we comfortably have a kind of human, we see something human in them.
Yeah, no, this is a critique of the field of interdisciplinary animal studies, and it holds. It's not simply that we are focusing on companion animals primarily. That's why the language of companion species, I think, is important to insist on. Also that we're focusing on mammals primarily, and land-based animals. There's a whole lot going on out there in the sea, and a whole history of people living on the sea, in many ways living off of the sea. that is perhaps one of the most dangerously under-considered aspects from an environmental perspective right now, the rape of the oceans, the ways in which the oceans are dying around us, and that we're not paying enough attention to companion species like phytoplankton who provide us with oxygen, and we provide them with oil spills. I don't really know. I have to ask Steve Zeman exactly more about that. But yeah, I think we do have to be more careful in our approaches. But I think it's also, there's a sort of logic to the field having developed in this way, in part because people do underestimate the sort of ordinariness of these relationships too, that there's often a lot going on there that isn't necessarily attended to carefully enough. And also, it's interesting to me, I think it's Barbara Smuts, the primatologist who has moved, there's been several primatologists in recent years who have moved towards studying traditional companion species. She's moved from baboons to dogs, I think, and Thelma Rowell, another primatologist, has moved from studying, I think, chimpanzees to studying sheep. And what they find, and Rowell is very articulate and forceful in articulating this counter-critique, is that when she tries to talk among primatologists about sheep, about the intelligence of sheep that she's tracking and you know, using the same methods or adapted methods from her previous work, she gets absolute silence back. You know, you're laughing. This is what they're thinking, yes, that she's lost it, right? Somehow she thinks sheep are smart. What? But she's shown through studying especially heritage breeds that the smartness is bred out of sheep, especially to keep them in larger and larger numbers together, and that these so-called feral species or older breeds perhaps, or sheep who are just pretty much left alone from human contact, can do very clever things, can solve problems, we really underestimate the capacities, and also what our involvement with them has done to their cognitive capacities as a species. So gotta wonder about what those, what did you say, cockroaches are actually doing to us. They're making us dumb. Maybe it's them who likes the Cheetos. Maybe it's them who likes the fast food. I don't know. Certainly isn't any good for us, right, to live this way. Pizza boxes, that's what the cockroaches like, right? Sorry, that's a great critique, and yeah, I'm guilty.
A follow-up point to that, I think, I know you know about this, but the audience might not, that if we look at the history of the use of the word animal in Europe, initially animal and human were not opposites. You know, Aristotle speaks of human beings as rational animals. And then we get up to the 16th, 17th century, and the term starts being used differently. They're humans and they're animals. It seems now we are reverting more to the older Aristotelian way of speaking. We're increasingly comfortable with the idea that human beings are a species of animal. And I'm wondering if this is some sort of parallel track to the developments that Catherine was asking about and you were responding to. I don't expect an answer, simply an observation.
Where you see this at the word level, I think there was a hand up way in the back, but yeah. Where you see this at the word level is the usage of who being replaced by that. People that watch TV. You see this, you're annoyed by this in your students' writing, but it's across the board. It's across the culture right now. So yeah, could be a turn back.
I'm a microbiologist, so by nature my questions are simplistic, and this literary theory is difficult for me. But I mean, what if what you're talking about is just an evolutionary trait for our survival? What I mean by that is sort of agricultural societies sort of lived with their animals. They farmed their animals. As we went into industrial society, we got away from animals. Many of our most dangerous diseases are zoonotic. In other words, transmitted by animals. So perhaps a closer relationship with these animals is simply protective by building our immune systems. Just a thought to throw out.
Thinking like a microbiologist.
And a follow-up question, how do you feel now, how has your way of thinking changed now that you know you are in fact a bacteria?
Oh, yeah, well, it's made me realize I'm never going to be a mad cow, right? Yeah, no, I think These are great questions, and yeah, I think.
By the way, I really appreciated you bringing Lynn Margulis into a literary talk.
I'll
Very
thank Donna
appropriate.
Haraway for that. That's the genealogy there. How have I changed since I started thinking of myself as bacteria? Can't answer that tonight. We'll have this conversation. It might not. Well, it's just this idea that they're pulling the strings, right, that we're not trying to do here. Question?
Yeah. In the book, Haraway talks about animal research extensively in one part. And I was going to ask you if you could comment on the difference between the mindset that you mentioned, which stems from the belief, thou shalt not kill, to thou shalt not make killable. Can you elaborate on that some?
Yeah, that's really the heart of our argument here. And I think finding ways to talk about that. I'm struggling with that portion, actually. I was thinking of that passage, that chapter a lot while I was writing this, knowing again that this is probably the most difficult passage for most readers who take these questions seriously. And I think my sense is, from reading an interview with her, a recently published one since, that she's still working on this question too. She's moving into actually agricultural science next to approach this question. And again, this is a question that's not the rarefied world of laboratory science. When we're talking about making animals who we call meat animals killable, we've already done that by calling them meat animals, you could say. But on the other hand, I don't think most people think when they're eating meat that they're eating an animal, or that that came from an animal, or that what they often really don't think about, and this is a microbial question, they're not thinking that they're eating a live tissue, a semi-living organism, a semi-living entity that can be hosting other very dangerous entities. The reason that 1 million pounds of salami were recalled over the weekend. Very interesting questions there. How can you make that killable? Most people who ate it probably want to know. But nonetheless, yeah, making killable. She's trying to get us into a different way of ethical thinking than we're comfortable with and that we're used to. And it's that kind of discomfort that's almost more important even than having that question answered of what that ethics looks like. In order to get there, we have to own our own responsiveness that way of feeling queasy about what it would mean to make someone killable. But I think what she's trying to do, from my understanding, is to work apart from a philosophical model that's so much focused on sacrifice and the foundation of the human subject and a basic sacrifice of the animal, of a cutting off from us what them are, yeah.
She also then mentions having a different perspective when we're eating animals from eating something else to eating someone else. So it's
yeah, the very end of it when the graduate students take her to the party where they're eating, a child has just been born and they're ritually eating the placenta. Yeah. You were thinking of that, I saw it in your eyes. Yeah, the end of the book does concern eating in particular, and she's trying to, by the end, understand how she can be in a department where there are, I believe, radical vegan colleagues and a colleague who's a hunter who hosts a department party to eat as kill. And these are people who ordinarily, Julia laughs, she knows, only in California, right? Yeah, so these are folks who ordinarily maybe aren't talking, who philosophically have reasons not to talk to each other, but who have a lot to learn from each other and who work together as colleagues, and in that working together are creating a model for, again, this responsive ethics that's incredibly difficult to visualize, again, that requires, I think, some aesthetic work of creating a language ahead of time. That's my pitch, or at least that's my excuse for not being able to answer that very good question. So, do we have more? Oh, yes.
Although there are a lot of shows that I would ask you how you would connect them. Two shows, the animal psychic, the woman who talks to different animals, and the other one is the crocodile man. So they present two different intersubjectivities, especially the woman who claims that she actually understands what they say and can communicate back to them what the owner wants to say. So she comes as a mediator of this human-animal communication. And on the other hand, the guy who was fighting and imposing his subjectivity on one of the most dangerous animals. So I was just wondering how you see, and I should admit I didn't read the book, so now I would read it with particular perspective.
No problem. I think Animal Planet, I don't have cable anymore, so I don't watch it. I think it's one of those things that I would get sucked into like that, though, if I did have cable. And the range of programming there is fascinating, and a subject that, it would be very interesting to talk to the producers about what they think they're doing with that show. It's also fascinating to look at the advertisers for that show. You're a sociologist, right? Yes? So,
Communications.
So, yes, so these questions of media and what choices are made in structuring something that's called Animal Planet, of all things. It's not the animal, or is there an Animal Channel as well? It's Animal Planet, right? Yes, it's not called Animal Channel, it's called Animal Planet, right? So, yeah, it's very fascinating. But I think, a lot of television programming focused on animals does reinforce this notion of subjectivity and does reinforce this notion of human subjectivity as paramount. The animal psychic, I always wonder, like, why does the animal never say, I hate animal psychics, you're full of it, you know? Surely animals think that at some point. They're capable of it. Show and deal with them if that's how they feel, right? She'd prove her psychicness, though, to me, if she could show me that they say that to her. Oh, I'm joking, but I think, once you start to look for that, it's very, not just easy to find, but it's also disturbing, because that there are a range of possibilities of conveying that message, and that they are used pretty aggressively to convey that message, that the human is dominating the animal, that inferior humans are inferior because they're insufficiently dominating the animal, that there are ways in which, there's a psychological problem with someone who doesn't get along with their pet. There's all kinds of messages coming through these shows that if you could take this step back, that Haraway's inviting us to take back from it and try to think about other possibilities, other ways of understanding what's happening in these interactions, a lot of things start to look different. The cultural contexts in which they're occurring, the historical moments at which they're occurring, these are all important factors that something, that is pretty dangerously seductive about Animal Planet doesn't really encourage you to critique, doesn't really encourage you to think more carefully about.
Having coincidentally watched The Whale Rider last night, I'm beginning to wonder whether what other so-called more primitive cultures or more connected to nature cultures have always seemed to have had, which is an understanding of that absolutely intimate relationship between humans and animals, is something that we're coming to a little bit too late, or I mean, can we ever get to that sensitivity as in the sort of more industrialized Western, it seems to be Western culture, that come from those other cultures that have had it for a long time?
Super question, and one that I think goes back to Julia's question about the danger of romanticizing relationships with animals. In some ways, if we just went back to a purer and more simple time, a whole lot of things would be better, not just our relationships with animals. But that's a fantasy. It's a powerful fantasy because we know we can't go back to that. We can't just forget that we live the way we do. Nonetheless, catastrophes happen, and nonetheless, radical shifts do happen for reasons that we don't necessarily predict or expect. And I think maybe figuring out ways of being open to that, maybe to trying to think about how we can work not just with a preservationist mentality. This is one of those things that Haraway is very queasy with, has her own sense of indigestion with, about the idea of keeping livestock animals as museum specimens. This would be the sort of radical vegan approach. That would be the only way in which they would survive. So thinking about what we're doing, how we're doing it, what other options there are, it's a very important question. I think I'd refer you to the novel, The Whale Rider, that the film is based on as well, because it opens out into some very different questions that the film just sort of elides very quickly. There's this whale rider story in the center of it that also shows up in Free Willy stories, that it's a sort of like indigenous myth thing. And it's disturbing to me. I haven't done much with this yet, but a student, one of our undergraduates, pointed that out to me the first time I taught the animals class. Her final research paper was on these various films in which the same sort of story shows up. And in looking back at the novel, it's very interesting to see how the novelist was thinking of something else with it. It is in part a kind of rethinking of modern New Zealand or contemporary New Zealand, and trying to undo some of that sort of industrial colonialist damage that has been done. But it very much isn't a story that circles back, that we just go back to the ways of nature. Instead, it's a story that insists that we deal with where we're coming from. I like to point out to students when I teach that novel that the very beginning of it very clearly flags the novelist as writing in New York to his daughters back in New Zealand. He's writing this novel because his daughters ask him, so can we watch a movie that doesn't have a Disney princess in it who is always the same, always getting the guy in the end? Can't she do anything else? So that was his inspiration, and also this geographical separation from his daughters, and knowing that there's something sort of missing in his own experience that way, and a broader sense too. So, excellent question.
Susan, thank you so much. I told you that to expect a great event and a great conversation, which I invite you to continue outside as people are awaiting us with food. And thank you so much. You know, we learned tremendously. I also wanted to let some of you know, if you're interested, we have a great event this coming Thursday. Dr. Richard Sims will be talking about the future of American education from an economic perspective. That I encourage you to attend if you have some time. So let us continue the conversation with in the same place. Yes. Susan, thank you so much. What an honor.
Thank you, Anouar. Thank you all for hanging out. This is excellent.